maybe it's time to split ADHD and ASD for good?
There is very few overlap where they're measuring both, and that's a problem. Those people reportedly are at higher risk.
We're still doing the research. It's still very new.
Conceptually, like, some of these things are just flawed. And so if you're feeling confused, so are the experts.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's research recap. I am here with Sarah, and we're going to tackle a topic that we've been talking about off air for a little while, but we haven't had the conversation to get us into it. And today we found an article that's going to help us do just that. What we're going to be talking about today is the concept of ADHD and ASD, specifically. Is it comorbid? Is it different? Should we be combining it in some way in future DSMs? Should we be separating it out? Who has it? Who has both? This is something that I think a lot of people are talking about a lot more these days. So we're going to get into it, and we're going to get into some of the research, the emerging new research, because we don't have a full answer to these questions right now that talk about this. So yeah, excited to get into it. How about you, Sarah?
I'm really excited to sort of speculate around this topic, sort of using these scientific papers sort of in our general way. Really excited to do this. It was sort of like a different kind of episode to prepare for, though, because this is an editorial that we're going to be talking about at the top. And I was just sort of like, how are we going to structure this, So yeah, we made it, and here we are.
Yeah, let us know what you think. So the first thing we're going to talk about, as you mentioned, is we're going to talk about a editorial by somebody called Philip Shaw, and we will describe who he is and what he's done in a second. But
it was very important to know.
Yes, we wanted to know, who is this man? It is from the American Journal of Psychiatry, and he wrote a very provocative titled editorial, which is the reason we ended up doing this topic, which is called ADHD and ASD, Time to Split or Lump. So he's published in the Journal of Psychiatry 14 times since 2010, and he's also the principal investigator for the National Human Genome Research Institute, which some of you may know because it's dedicated to mapping genetics in general. So yeah, the guy knows his stuff. And basically what he wanted to do was he wanted to talk about a recent paper that was published about ADHD and ASD, and essentially the concept that maybe it's time to split ADHD and ASD for good, as in think of them as two distinct separate areas. So Sarah, do you want to take us through a little bit about what his thinking was around that?
I think it would be good first to talk about that meta-analysis that he's writing about first a little bit more, because as you say, it was a meta-analysis of 243 studies, test-based MRI studies looking at ADHD and autism, and basically just looking at the brain activity in the different regions and seeing where they were similar and where they were different from each other, from neurotypicals, the whole thing. Their conclusion was there are more structural differences between the disorders. And so, it's time to split. And then here comes Philip Shaw. He entered the room and he was like, but guys, there's a third option, and that is to get more data.
Which I will argue is all of academia. That is a third option. But he had a few good points as well about what kind of data we should be getting, what kind of extra data we should be collecting.
Yes. So the opinion is tucked nicely right at the end of all of his suggestions for how this field of study could be improved and sort of why it's kind of important. So the first thing that he had to say about this is that we need more fMRI studies where the ADHD and the ASD participants are performing the same task. So as he goes on to explain how current research tends to look at these diagnoses is ADHD kids or adults get given tasks that focus on attention and memory. ASD kids and adults get given tasks on socializing and communication skills. And, there is very few overlap where they're measuring both. And that's a problem.
Exactly. Which makes it quite hard to even get a sense of how they're different and how they're similar. So specifically, they talked about this idea of active versus resting state fMRI studies, and the idea that scans which are acquired when participants are free of any explicit task demands, resting state fMRI, could be easier and is easier in general if you are doing these kind of meta-analyses to synchronize when you're looking at brain studies. So if we looked at people who are in a resting state who have autism, or people who are in a resting state who have ADHD or anything really, it's a lot easier for people to do these big comparisons versus when you're asking people to do totally different tasks and you're measuring their brain activity at that point.
Would that theoretically increase the number of people that we could scan, or is that not the point?
I don't think so, because you'd still have to put somebody into an fMRI. And so that would, it wouldn't really make a difference. It's sort of part of his other conversation, which is it might be good to include some of the studies that weren't published. Generally speaking, I think a lot of you know about the significant results bias, where studies that have results of like differences, for example, are more likely to be published, or maybe results of similarities, like whatever they're looking for, they're more likely to publish interesting findings. So I don't know how many people study a brain not doing anything.
Probably very few these days. That headline does not sell.
A brain did nothing and it was interesting. It created differences. Yeah. So and to your point, like it's hard to get that kind of, you've got to get somebody in, you've got to measure them, and everyone's like, what are we measuring? And they're like, we're measuring nothing. I mean, you could make an argument, and we're being purely speculative here, because look, Shaw gave us the ability to speculate. He wrote an editorial, and now we are speculating as well. Maybe we should set it up with an expectation that a lot of these studies will measure and, provide data for the resting brain of everybody. If we could have a big database, like a resting brain database, that would be very cool. We could do a lot of potentially very cool research with that, rather than focusing just on a specific activity. Because to your point, they're already there. They're already doing the task. Maybe they could just do a little bit of nothing as well.
I suspect they would find a lot of unintended things. He goes into the results of that meta-analysis a little bit. There are two particular areas in which ADHD and ASD groups showed greater activation: the right rectus and right lingual gyra, I don't know, whatever. But those areas aren't really looked at in the neurodivergent condition space. Like, we don't look at that for ADHD or autism. So nobody's studying that. And so Shaw says in this paper, there may be some findings that have just been there in plain view, but that we're just not looking at because we don't see enough of them, because we're only looking for what we're looking for.
Yeah. And we're often doing it with very small samples as well.
Limited resources.
Exactly. What do you think he thought? Because he had a few perspectives and he wrote it down. He had a few, very good points. If you were to, having read it, Sarah, to get a sense of what he was thinking, what do you think he was thinking?
So I think this is a sort of a cautionary tale against thinking we've found it. Sort of cautioning us against jumping to any conclusions about what the data is saying. Is this the same? Is this different? Really, we don't actually know yet. And this is someone who works, in the field of genetics. They're mapping the genome, which, if you remember from our episode like a year ago, we were talking about, the genome sort of is like the code for your whole body. And so there's like ADHD in there, if you're ADHD. And so this is the perspective that he's coming from. And he's just saying, like, we don't actually have the data that we need because we're not looking for this yet.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's a reminder as well, in this conversation of like, oh, well, what is it? Do we have ADHD? Do we have ASD? Do we have both? As we're having this conversation as more late diagnosed people, because I've been speaking to so many of you who've realized that they have ADHD and now wondering if they have ASD as well, it's important to remember that this area is very new. So regardless of what you might be told by anybody at all, there's still a lot out there. People might say, oh, well, if you have ADHD, you definitely also have autism. Or if you have autism, you definitely also have ADHD. But if there's something doesn't feel like it fits you, we're still doing the research. It's still very new. Going with how you feel is a valid option as well in terms of whether or not you want to seek an additional diagnosis.
Yeah, I'm just going to jump right ahead to something that is said in another paper, and that is many of the assessment and evaluation tools for ASD were not developed with average intelligence in mind.
What does that mean?
That means that they were looking for an intellectual disability.
Oh, interesting.
They weren't looking for autism, really. Yeah. I mean, conceptually, like some of these things are just flawed. And so now we're starting to clean up that mess, I guess. And so if you're feeling confused, so are the experts.
I guess that's a good way of putting it. Yeah, if you're feeling confused, so are the experts. I think we can probably name the whole whole thing.
That's the title of the episode.
Yeah. ADHD and ASD. If you're feeling confused, so are the experts, because it is confusing, and one of the reasons, as you just alluded to, is because a lot of these diagnostic tests were created with differences in mind. A good example of that is, and we talk about this a lot, ASD was designed to find certain things, like you said, but also, is it great for women? There's arguments about that. And I'm not going to get into that because it's a whole other topic. But yeah, it's worth thinking about as well.
We know that ADHD can feel overwhelming and frustrating, and that's on a good day. And we don't want anyone to have to navigate that alone.
That's why we created the ADHD Academy, where adults with ADHD can meet, join, share stories, and support each other in a judgment-free way. If you want to connect with others who truly understand you and learn research-based strategies to help you feel more in control and build momentum in your life and work, you found the right place.
Together, let's transform your ADHD challenges into strengths. If you'd like to know more, you can click the link below to join us in the ADHD Academy.
Hope to see you there. Well, should we jump into the second paper then, since you've already alluded that we have more coming? So the title of that paper was ADHD and ASD Towards Better Diagnosis and Management. And this paper came from medRxiv and was essentially focusing on a literature review of the prevalence of the comorbidity of ADHD and ASD. And so we thought it was an interesting contrast to this other discussion because they were looking at comorbidity specifically. So what were they finding, Sarah?
Yeah, I basically just wanted to provide something that gave like background. They looked at, the comorbidity. They looked at some neurobiological stuff, the functional brain stuff. They looked at symptoms and assessment methods and treatment. Mm-hmm. This paper was interesting. The way it was cited was a little bit confusing to me. There were some occasions where I wasn't sure if it was a citation or an opinion. I think the author's native language was not English, so, I'm giving a lot of grace to that. I would say this was probably not a systematic literature review. It doesn't say specifically, and it doesn't give any sort of methodology on that, so I think it would if it was.
It was an interesting alternative. Yeah.
It brought me to another paper, which talked about sort of the treatment and management of ASD and ADHD.
Yeah. Before we jump into that one, because I agree that one was very interesting as well. What was the sort of overall conclusion of this paper in terms of whether there was a prevalence of comorbidity or whether there wasn't?
Sure. So the prevalence reported in this paper is huge. The prevalence of ASD is increasing steadily with each year. The prevalence of comorbidity is estimated ADHD in individuals with ASD, 50 to 70. I would say that the prevalence of co-occurring ADHD and ASD has a very wide range, right? There are some papers that put it as low as 13%. That was cited here. And then there are other papers that cite as high as 70%. Obviously, which way, like which diagnosis came first also fudges the numbers. So this is a really conceptually confusing topic. And I think, I really hope that we get this under control a little bit better because
it was rough to read. We've been talking about this topic for a while and we've been trying to figure out how to tackle it.
The ages of diagnosis are different. I mean, there are so many like inconsistent variables that we're trying to look at here.
As Shaw writes, as he points out.
He sure does.
Yeah.
Go mega analysis.
Exactly.
So it's high. It's super high. It cites functional differences in the brain, which again, pretty much every paper we look at talks about that.
Yeah, for sure.
It talks about symptomology, which again, nothing new there, nothing to add to our conversation. But really, why did they write this paper? Because there's not enough treatment options available for people with co-occurring ADHD and ASD. Those people reportedly are at higher risk just because like the ADHD medication doesn't work for your autism.
Exactly. Although they did talk about how the medication patterns occurred, and we actually pulled up the article that they referenced.
Oh, that's the segue.
Yep, I'm segueing. They referenced the symptom score and medication treatment patterns in children with ADHD versus autism from the Journal of Psychiatry Research from 2020. And that was really interesting. So, yeah, do you want to take us through what they found there, Sarah?
Sure. So they had, a sample size in the low thousands. I think it's like 2,500-ish. And basically, ADHD medications were more often prescribed than any other medication type.
Yeah.
In all those diagnostic groups. Children with ADHD combined type were most likely to be prescribed an ADHD medication, whereas the inattentive type were least likely to be medicated.
Because they said that they were the least impaired, and my heart broke for all those masking inattentive ADHD people who didn't get medication because it didn't affect other people externally. But anyway.
Yep. Yeah, it's hard. It's so hard to read these things sometimes because it's like, guys, you walked right up to the point. What are you talking about? How could that be your conclusion?
Yeah, but then the medication discussion itself is obviously, and the medication, whether you get medication or whether your child gets medication is a personal decision. I just thought it was interesting, their perspective on why that didn't happen in some cases.
Yeah, and then really the only thing left to say here is that the children with autism were more likely to be given antidepressants.
Yeah. And they didn't really talk about what people felt about that or anything. They were more just pointing it out. But yeah, it is sort of, I guess, to kind of wrap all of these studies together and come back to our light of this, our focus of this, which is Bernard Shaw's perspective on it. There is so much going on in this area right now. Even the latest paper that we referenced was from 2020. And, it sort of indicates just how much of a growing focus this is on going, okay, if there was to be another DSM, where would it put autism and where would it put ADHD? Are we going to put it in a cloud because there is comorbidity? Are we going to say, no, it's very distinct and we need to just say it's distinct? We know we need more research on it. But yeah, definitely pointing out the confusion that exists in this space right now.
And if anyone wants to speculate and knows what the options might be, what could the DSM committee actually decide to do with this, definitely email us, message us on Instagram. I want to talk to you about that because, the future could be amazing. But it would be awful if we jumped to conclusions and set ourselves back just looking for an answer.
And, that you can really see how that works here when you talk about that medication treatment pattern. It's how you get diagnosed and what you get diagnosed with first affects how you receive support. And if you receive support that is working for you and fits you, no matter how that support is given, it's going to be helpful for you. And, if you don't, then it's not. It sounds like a simple point, but it's important.
Well, you're way more likely to stick with something that actually is making a change in your life.
Exactly.
And if you're doing something for like 10 years and you're like, you know what, I really just I can't be doing this right. Like there's no way. The whole time that wasn't the color for you.
Exactly. So it is an important conversation, and I am glad that people are looking into it. I really hope that they do more research, because I know that so many of you right now are looking at both of these diagnoses and going, okay, are we talking one? Are we talking the other? Are we talking both? Like, what's happening here for yourself and for your kids as well?
And then the question becomes, what does that mean? And how does that change what I already know? And
exactly.
I think, unfortunately, even the support professionals don't have a fantastic answer for us.
Yeah.
But personally, I've been really relying on the neurodivergent people who are in those support professions, the autistics who are also clinicians, the ADHD researchers, like all of them.
Yeah. And definitely, if you have any research, send it along. We will be here to talk about it. That's the support that we want to provide. Is as soon as it comes out, we want to be able to share it and to be able to give you a sense of where things are going. But yeah, that's it for today. I do want to just say a huge thank you to Sarah for doing this research recap. This was a lot of different pieces coming together, different way of thinking about things. So yeah, you do a wonderful job every week, Sarah. So I just wanted to point that out.
Thank you.
And yeah, we'll see you guys next week.
Bye.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to reach out or connect with us, you can leave us a message at admin@unconventionalorganization.com.
You can also find out more about our ADHD coaching organization, read our free articles, or sign up to our online courses at unconventionalorganization.com. That's organization with a Z or an S. They both will get you there.
If you'd like to learn more about what we discussed here today, or you want to read the transcript, you can find that at our show notes page at unconventionalorganization.com.
If you've enjoyed this podcast and think someone else might find the strategies and stories helpful, the best thing you can do is share episodes using the share button in the podcast player, or leave a 5-star review on Apple or Spotify or your podcast player of choice, letting them know why you've benefited from this podcast.
Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you back in the ADHD lab next week.